September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. The first light of dawn breaks over the misty fields of the Polish countryside. Birds chirp their morning song. A farmer walks through his wheat field, completely unaware that his world is about to end. The world holds its breath in these final moments of peace. Across the border, 1.5 million German soldiers wait in the darkness. They have been waiting for this moment. The moment when Adolf Hitler would unleash his vision of conquest upon an unsuspecting world. The distant rumble of engines grows louder. The farmer stops, looks toward the horizon. But this morning would not be like any other morning. This was the morning that would change everything. This was the morning the world went to war. The invasion didn't actually begin at dawn. It began with a lie. The night before, August 31st, SS operatives dressed as Polish soldiers staged a fake attack on a German radio station at Gleiwitz. It was theater. Deadly theater designed to give Hitler his excuse. These weren't Polish soldiers. They were prisoners from concentration camps, dressed in Polish uniforms, murdered to create evidence of Polish aggression. Hitler needed his justification. He would manufacture it. Later that day, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, declaring, quote, "Since 5:45 this morning, we have been returning fire. From now on, bombs will be met with bombs." End quote. It was a lie. Poland hadn't fired first. Poland hadn't attacked. But the lie would be enough. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, without a declaration of war, the German Wehrmacht crossed the border. Fall Weiss, Case White. That was the code name for the invasion of Poland. Meticulously planned over months, it would introduce the world to a new form of warfare. They would call it Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. 53 divisions, over 1.5 million men, 2,500 tanks, nearly 2,000 aircraft, all coordinated in a symphony of destruction that the world had never seen before. What made Blitzkrieg revolutionary wasn't just the technology, the tanks, the planes, the radios. It was the coordination. For the first time in military history, you had ground forces, armor and air power, all working together in real time, moving at incredible speed, punching through enemy lines before they could react. This wasn't the static trench warfare of World War I. This was movement, speed, shock, and overwhelming force applied at the point of attack. At the exact same moment, 150 miles north at the Westerplatte Peninsula, near the free city of Gdansk, the old German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Polish positions. The ship had been in harbor for days, supposedly on a friendly visit. But at 4:45 a.m., her 11-inch guns spoke a different language. The Polish garrison of 182 men suddenly found themselves under bombardment from a battleship. Major Henryk Sucharski commanded the Westerplatte garrison. He had ammunition for 7 days, food for 7 days. The Germans expected him to surrender within hours. He would hold out for 7 days. 7 days, that would become legend. Polish soldiers scrambled from their barracks, diving for cover as shells exploded around them. They manned their defensive positions, anti-aircraft guns opening fire against impossible odds. But Westerplatte was just one front. Across Poland, the Luftwaffe was already in the air. Their mission: destroy the Polish Air Force before it could even take off. Bombs fell on Polish airfields. Aircraft exploded on the ground. Pilots ran toward their planes, many cut down by strafing fire. The Polish Air Force had 400 aircraft. Within hours, half were destroyed. But not all. The Poles had anticipated this. They had dispersed many aircraft to hidden airfields. The survivors would fight on, outnumbered outgunned, but never defeated. Polish PZL P-11 fighters, though obsolete compared to German Messerschmitts, would continue taking off from camouflaged fields throughout the campaign. The German plan was elegant in its brutality. Two massive army groups would strike simultaneously from the north and south, creating a giant pincer that would trap the bulk of the Polish army in western Poland. Army Group North, under General Fedor von Bock, would drive south from East Prussia and Pomerania. Army Group South, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, would surge north from Silesia and Slovakia. They would meet east of Warsaw, cutting Poland in half. Behind this strategic concept was a tactical revolution. Panzer divisions would punch through Polish lines, racing deep into enemy territory. They wouldn't stop to consolidate. They wouldn't wait for the infantry. They would keep moving, creating chaos, destroying command and control, preventing the enemy from forming coherent defensive lines. This was warfare at a tempo the world had never seen. Poland's strategic position was impossible. They had to defend a 1,750-mile border with outdated equipment against a modern mechanized army. But what people forget is that Poland didn't surrender quickly. They fought. They fought hard. Against overwhelming odds, they fought with everything they had. The Polish army had 800,000 men. They were brave. They were determined. But they were fatally unprepared for what was coming. Polish soldiers in hastily prepared defensive positions heard the sound of approaching tanks growing louder. Through the trees, panzer tanks emerged. Polish officers shouted orders. Anti-tank guns opened fire. Some shots bounced off the armor. Others found their mark. Poland's anti-tank weapons were adequate against the lighter Panzer I and II tanks, but against the heavier Panzer III and IV, they were nearly useless. And there were simply too many. A panzer would be hit, smoke pouring from it. But behind it, dozens more kept coming. The mathematics of modern warfare were brutal. Poland could destroy individual tanks, kill individual soldiers, win individual engagements, but they couldn't stop the tide. No image from the Polish campaign has been more misunderstood than the cavalry charge at Krojanty. It has become a symbol of Polish backwardness, brave but foolish cavalry charging against tanks with lances. But that's not what happened. The truth is more complex and more tragic. The 18th Lancer Regiment emerged from a forest on September 1st. German infantry was ahead, not tanks. The Polish cavalry charged, sabers drawn, scattering the German infantry. The charge was against infantry, not tanks, and initially it succeeded. But then German armored cars appeared from the flanks, machine guns opening fire. The cavalry, caught in the open, was massacred. Horses and men fell under machine gun fire. Later, German propaganda would spin this into a tale of Polish cavalry charging tanks. The myth persisted for decades, but the truth was different. The cavalry at Krojanty were trained soldiers executing a legitimate military tactic. They were mobile infantry, trained to fight on horseback and on foot. They carried rifles, machine guns, anti-tank weapons. The charge at Krojanty was tactical, not suicidal. It was simply one of those moments where everything went wrong. At 4:40 a.m. on September 1st, 5 minutes before the invasion officially began, the Luftwaffe bombed the town of Wielun. It was a small town of no military importance. It had clearly marked hospitals. It had civilians sleeping in their homes. The Stukas came in waves. For 2 hours, they systematically destroyed the town. 75% of Wielun was leveled. Over 1,200 civilians were killed. The hospital, clearly marked with red crosses, was bombed repeatedly. Why Wielun? To this day, historians debate. There were no military targets. Some say it was practice, some say it was a navigation error, some say it was intentional terror, meant to break Polish will to resist. Whatever the reason, Wielun became the first city bombed in World War II, the first of thousands, the beginning of a new kind of warfare where the distinction between soldier and civilian would blur and then disappear entirely. By afternoon of the first day, the Luftwaffe reached Warsaw. The Polish capital, a city of 1.3 million people, found itself under aerial bombardment. People ran for cover. Bombs fell. Buildings exploded. But Warsaw would not panic. Not yet. These people had no idea what was coming. They couldn't know that their city would endure 25 days of constant bombardment. They couldn't know that by the end, 25,000 civilians would be dead, and 40% of their city would be destroyed. Not all battles went Germany's way. At Mokra, the German 4th Panzer Division ran into the Polish Volhynian Cavalry Brigade. What happened next surprised everyone. The Volhynian Cavalry Brigade wasn't just men on horses. They had artillery. They had anti-tank guns. They had excellent defensive positions. And they were commanded by Colonel Stanislaw Maczek, one of the finest tactical minds in the Polish army. As panzer tanks advanced across open ground, Colonel Maczek ordered his men to hold fire until the Germans came into range. Polish anti-tank guns opened fire. Multiple panzers were hit and disabled. The 4th Panzer Division lost 50 tanks at Mokra. They were forced to withdraw and call for reinforcements. For one day, at one place, the Polish cavalry beat the German armor. But Mokra was an exception that proved the rule. Poland could win battles, but they couldn't win the war. The mathematics were against them. For every German tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every German plane shot down, 3 more took its place. In London and Paris, the governments of Britain and France faced a terrible choice. Both had guaranteed Polish independence. Both had promised to come to Poland's aid if attacked. Now that promise would be tested. British and French officials received reports from Poland. They debated what to do. Britain and France would declare war on Germany on September 3rd, but they would do nothing. No offensive was launched in the West. No serious attempt was made to relieve pressure on Poland. The French army, the largest in Europe, sat behind the Maginot Line and waited. Later, it would be called the Phony War or Blitzkrieg, the Sitting War. While Poland burned, the Western Allies did nothing. Germany had gambled that they wouldn't intervene effectively. They were right. The betrayal of Poland in September 1939 was one of the great moral failures of the war. Britain and France had the power to attack Germany from the west. They had superiority in numbers and equipment, but they lacked the will. They hoped the war would somehow end without major fighting. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. By September 3rd, German forces were advancing on all fronts. The Polish army was fighting desperately, but the situation was already critical. Polish refugees fled eastward, clogging the roads. German Stukas strafed columns of civilians. Polish defensive positions were overrun. Cities and towns burned. The refugees created their own problems. Roads became clogged with civilians fleeing east, blocking Polish military units trying to move west to the front. German aircraft deliberately targeted these refugee columns, creating panic and chaos. This was total war. The concept that had been theoretical before 1939 was now reality. There was no front line. There was no rear area. Everyone was a target. Everyone was in danger. On September 9th, the Polish army launched its largest counterattack of the campaign. 20 divisions struck the exposed flank of the German 8th Army near the Bzura River. For a brief moment, it looked like Poland might achieve something remarkable. The German Eighth Army was in trouble, falling back in disorder. Polish troops recaptured several towns. The counterattack threatened to cut off German spearheads driving toward Warsaw. But the Luftwaffe responded within hours. Hundreds of aircraft pounded the Polish positions. German armored units rushed north to close the gap. And the Polish forces, successful in their initial assault, found themselves trapped in a pocket. The battle became a massacre. Polish units were surrounded and under constant air attack. The Battle of Bzura became the largest battle of the campaign. For 10 days, 170,000 Polish soldiers fought against encirclement. Some broke out. Some fought to the last bullet. By September 19th, when the battle ended, 120,000 Polish soldiers had been killed or captured. Columns of Polish prisoners of war marched into captivity. Bzura showed both the courage and the tragedy of Poland's defense. They could still fight. They could still attack. They could still hurt the Germans. But they couldn't change the outcome. The mathematics of modern war were brutal and unforgiving. September 17th, 2.5 weeks into the war. Poland was fighting for its life against Germany. And then, at dawn, from the east, came the final betrayal. The Soviet Union, having signed a secret pact with Nazi Germany just weeks before, invaded Poland from the east. 800,000 Soviet soldiers crossed the border. Poland now faced enemies on two fronts. Polish soldiers on the eastern border, exhausted and focused on the German threat from the west, stared in disbelief as Soviet tanks and trucks crossed the border. They were supposed to be allies. Why were the Soviets attacking? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23rd, contained a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Poland would be split between them. The two totalitarian powers had made their deal. Poland was the price. The Soviet invasion is often forgotten in the West, but for Poles, it was a second dagger in the back. They were already fighting Germany with everything they had. Now they had to fight the Soviets too. It was the final proof that Poland had been abandoned by the world. The Soviet invasion would have consequences that echoed for decades. Soviet forces captured over 200,000 Polish soldiers and officers. Most of the enlisted men were released. The officers were not. In the spring of 1940, in the Katyn Forest and other locations, the Soviet NKVD systematically murdered 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and leaders. A bullet to the back of the head, one by one, day after day. The Soviets would blame the Germans would blame the Soviets. The truth wouldn't be officially acknowledged until 1990. This was the fate that awaited Poland's captured elite. This was the cost of the Soviet invasion. This was why September 17, 1939, lives in Polish memory alongside September 1st. Two invasions, two betrayals, one country trying desperately to survive. While Poland's armies disintegrated, Warsaw fought on. The capital, defended by 120,000 troops and armed civilians, refused to surrender. Citizens built barricades in the streets. Women and children dug trenches. Mayor Stefan Starzyński rallied the population. His radio broadcasts became legendary. Even as German shells rained down, even as the city burned, his voice remained calm, defiant, inspiring. Mayor Starzyński broadcast to the citizens of Warsaw, saying, "We are defending ourselves. We will defend every street, every house, every stone of our capital. Warsaw will never surrender." But the bombardment continued. Wave after wave of German aircraft attacked the city. On September 25th, the Luftwaffe launched the largest concentrated air attack of the campaign. Over 1,150 aircraft dropped 560 tons of high explosive and 72 tons of incendiary bombs on the city. They called it Black Monday. The city was engulfed in flames. Buildings collapsed. Firestorms raged. Survivors described the sky turning red. The air was so hot people couldn't breathe. Buildings exploded all around them. The screaming, the smoke. Many thought the world was ending. 25,000 civilians died in the bombing of Warsaw. Water mains were destroyed. Food ran out. Medical supplies ran out. The wounded died in the streets because there was nowhere to take them. And still, Warsaw fought. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th. But the war wasn't over. Small units continued fighting, trying to break through to Romania, to Hungary, anywhere they could escape and continue the fight. Polish units retreated eastward, harassed by both German and Soviet forces. The last battle was fought at Kok, a small town in eastern Poland. From October 2nd to 5th, the independent operational group Polesi, commanded by General Franciszek Kleeberg, held off German attacks. Kleeberg had 17,000 men. He could have tried to flee to Romania. Instead, he chose to fight one more battle, to show the world that Poland had not given up, that Polish soldiers, even in defeat, would go down fighting. Polish soldiers in defensive positions were low on ammunition, low on food, but still fighting. The final German assault came. Polish positions were being overrun. General Kleeberg told his officers to tell the men they fought with honor. Tell them Poland will rise again. On October 5th, with no ammunition left, no food, no hope of relief, General Kleeberg surrendered. The September campaign was over. Poland had fallen. But it had taken 35 days. 35 days longer than Hitler had expected. 35 days that would be remembered. The cost of Poland's defense was staggering. 66,000 Polish soldiers were killed. 133,000 were wounded. 694,000 were taken prisoner by the Germans and Soviets. But the military casualties were only the beginning. 150,000 civilians died in the September campaign. 25,000 in Warsaw alone. Wieluń, Frampol. Dozens of towns and cities bombed into rubble. And this was just the first month. For Poland, September 1939 was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of 6 years of occupation, of resistance, of suffering on a scale almost unimaginable. The Polish government escaped to Romania, then to Paris, and eventually to London. They established a government in exile. They would never recognize the defeat, never accept the occupation, never stop fighting. Polish forces would fight on every front of the war. In the Battle of Britain, Polish pilots were the most effective per capita. At Monte Cassino, Polish soldiers would break through where others had failed. At Arnhem, the Polish parachute brigade would fight to the last man. Poland never surrendered. Not in September 1939, not ever. They formed the fourth largest Allied army in Europe. They had the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe. They fought on every continent. The world may have forgotten them in September 1939, but they never forgot themselves. Inside occupied Poland, resistance began almost immediately. The Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, would become the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe. 400,000 members at its peak. They gathered intelligence for the Allies. They sabotaged German supply lines. They prepared for an eventual uprising. They rescued Jews from the Holocaust. They maintained Polish identity when both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia wanted to erase it from history. Historians have spent 85 years debating. Could Poland have been saved? What if Britain and France had attacked Germany from the west? What if the Soviet Union hadn't invaded? What if Poland had mobilized earlier? If France had launched a serious offensive in September 1939, Germany would have been in serious trouble. They had most of their army in Poland. The Western Front was lightly defended, but France wasn't ready psychologically for another major war. The trauma of World War I was too recent. They wanted to avoid casualties at all costs. The real tragedy is that Poland was actually militarily competent. They had good soldiers, good officers, reasonable equipment. They were simply outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting on two fronts against two superpowers. The truth is probably simpler and sadder. Poland was geographically positioned between two aggressive totalitarian states. When they made their deal, Poland's fate was sealed. No amount of bravery, no tactical brilliance, no last stands could change that fundamental reality. But Poland's defeat taught the world crucial lessons. Blitzkrieg worked. Combined arms operations, tanks, aircraft, and infantry, coordinated through radio communications, could defeat larger traditional armies. France watched what happened to Poland. They saw Blitzkrieg in action. They had 8 months to prepare. It wouldn't be enough. In May 1940, Germany would do to France what they did to Poland. Only faster. Poland was Hitler's laboratory. He tested his new way of war there. He learned what worked and what didn't. The speed of the Panzer advance, the use of air power, the integration of all arms, all of this was refined in Poland. And then he used those lessons to conquer most of Europe in the next 2 years. But beyond the strategy, beyond the tactics, beyond the numbers and maps and analysis, there were people. Millions of people whose lives were shattered in September 1939. Witold Urbanowicz was a Polish fighter pilot. In September 1939, he shot down 5 German aircraft despite flying an obsolete fighter. He escaped to Britain, joined the Royal Air Force, and shot down 15 more German planes in the Battle of Britain. He survived the war and lived to old age, but he never forgot those September days when Poland fought alone. Jan Karski was a young officer in the Polish army. Captured by the Soviets, he escaped and joined the resistance. He was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and witnessed the Holocaust firsthand. He traveled to Britain and America, trying to tell the world what was happening. Few believed him. After the war, he became a professor in America, spending his life teaching about the war and the Holocaust. Irina Sendler was a social worker in Warsaw. During the occupation, she smuggled over 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, saving them from certain death. She was eventually caught by the Gestapo, tortured, and sentenced to death. The resistance rescued her at the last moment. She survived the war and lived until 2008, honored as one of the righteous among the nations. These are just 3 stories among millions, 3 lives among the countless lives changed forever by September 1939. Each person had hopes, dreams, plans for the future. All of it shattered in those 35 days. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was more than just a military campaign. It was a turning point in human history. It demonstrated that the treaties and agreements that had maintained peace since 1918 were worthless. It showed that aggression could succeed. It proved that the democracies would not effectively resist totalitarian expansion. But it also showed something else. It showed that ordinary people, when faced with overwhelming evil, could still resist, could still fight, could still maintain their dignity and humanity, even in the face of barbarism. The Polish soldiers who fought at Westerplatte, at Mokra, at Bzura, at Warsaw, at Kock, They knew they couldn't win. They fought anyway. Not because they were stupid or suicidal, but because some things are worth fighting for even when victory is impossible. The civilians of Warsaw, who built barricades and dug trenches, who stayed in their burning city rather than surrender, they knew the odds. They stayed anyway. The resistance fighters who would spend the next 6 years fighting an invisible war against 2 occupying powers, they knew the risks. They fought anyway. September 1939 was the month the modern world was born. The world of total war, of mechanized killing, of civilians as targets, of genocide as policy. But it was also the month that showed human resilience, human courage, human refusal to submit, even in the darkest times. Today, more than 85 years later, we remember September 1939, not just as the beginning of World War II, but as a lesson about the cost of appeasement, a lesson about the danger of totalitarianism, a lesson about the importance of standing up to aggression early before it becomes unstoppable. But most importantly, we remember it as a testament to the Polish people, who fought when fighting seemed hopeless, who resisted when resistance seemed futile, who maintained their identity, their culture, their nation, even when the most powerful empires in the world tried to erase them from history. Poland fell in September 1939, but Poland never surrendered. And in 1989, 50 years after the invasion, Poland was free again. The Nazi regime that invaded them had long since been destroyed. The Soviet regime that betrayed them had collapsed. But Poland endured. Poland survived. Poland won, in the end, by simply refusing to die. That is the lesson of September 1939. That is why we remember. That is why we tell this story. Not because of the tanks or the tactics or the battles, important as those are, but because of what it shows us about human nature, about courage, about resilience, about the refusal to accept evil as inevitable. September 1st, 1939, was the day the world changed forever. It was the day the Second World War began. It was the day that would lead to 6 years of unprecedented death and destruction. 70 million people would die before it was over. Entire cities would be leveled. The Holocaust would consume 6 million Jews. The world would be transformed in ways no one in September 1939 could have imagined. But it started with Poland. It started with 1.5 million German soldiers crossing a border at dawn. It started with Polish soldiers and civilians deciding to resist. And that resistance, though it failed militarily, succeeded in a deeper way. It showed the world what was at stake. It showed the world what they were fighting for. It showed the world that surrender was not the only option. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was a military defeat, but it was also a moral victory. And in the long run, moral victories matter more than military defeats. Poland lost the battle, but won the war. Lost the campaign, but kept its soul. Fell to its enemies, but rose again stronger. That is the story of September 1939. That is the story of Poland. That is the story that deserves to be told and remembered and passed down to future generations, not just as history, but as inspiration, not just as facts and dates and battles, but as a reminder of what humans can endure, what they can survive, what they can overcome. September 1st, 1939, the day the world changed forever, the day Poland fell, the day Poland fought back, the day that reminds us that even in our darkest hours, Even when all seems lost, even when the enemy is at the gates, we have a choice. We can surrender, or we can fight. Poland chose to fight. And that choice made all the difference.